Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. Behind me, you can see the statue of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. We're on Solzhenitsyn Street in Moscow, a street which is obviously named in his honor. So he was one of the most celebrated Russian writers of the late 20th century, having been born in 1918. And he grew up in an ordinary family, far from Moscow. He became a teacher, and it was the height of Stalinism, the 1930s, and obviously education, a lot of it was about communist indoctrination at the time. So he was in the Red Army during the Second World War, in the artillery. He fought valiantly, and he advanced into Germany. And he said certain things about the conduct of the Red Army that are not legal to say, which is astonishing, because in the Russian Federation it is a crime to attempt to diminish the glory of the Red Army, to say anything that would reflect discredit upon the Red Army. It's very curious because President Putin, he honored Solzhenitsyn late in life, and indeed unveiled the statue here only a few months ago. So if what Solzhenitsyn was saying was a terrible slur and an outright lie, surely the president wouldn't do that. He hasn't quite made his mind up. Anyway, just after the Second World War, he wrote a letter to his friend in which he criticized the government. That was then counted as anti-Soviet agitation. There were these legal catch-alls, things like that, just anything which was remotely critical of the government, and that was enough to have him sent to the Gulag for 10 years. Gulag meaning main camp administration. It's an acronym. So there was obviously colonialism in the Soviet Union, as in labor colonies, so people sent to do penal servitude, hard labor on starvation rations, living without adequate clothing or medical care or anything, doing very heavy work in the frozen wastes in Siberia and Kazakhstan. So after several years he was finally set free, he then became a writer, and he wrote much about his experiences, the brutality that he experienced there. And so one of his most renowned novels is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, as in a prisoner who was held somewhere remote, or there's the Gulag Archipelago, as in a group of islands where people were held as slave laborers and so on. So in the late 50s there was the thaw under Nikita Khrushchev, the new general secretary of the Communist Party, and so people were allowed to publish things which previously would have had them sent to prison for years. Although under Brezhnev in the 60s it was rolled back somewhat. It never went all the way back to Stalinism. So he's a dissident. He was getting in trouble for continuously criticizing the communist government, feeling that this undermined the family and deprived people of their freedom of expression and so forth. So his fame reached the Western world, and there were some samizdat publications, and self-published, just on typewriters and things like that, to get the word out here. And some of his novels were smuggled abroad to be published in the original language and in translation. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. The Soviet government wouldn't allow him to receive it. Finally, in the 70s, he was such a headache for the government that they sent him abroad. And that was that. So he went to live in the United States, and he lived in Vermont. He'd been reading English since his childhood, but his conversational English was very poor. He was best acquainted with the language through classic works of 19th century and 18th century novelists. And he liked Vermont because he said its long, chilly winters reminded him of his homeland, but he didn't produce any oeuvre in his period in exile to match anything that he'd written here. And when he left the country, he was stripped of Soviet citizenship and convicted of various crimes in absentia, and he said he wouldn't return till communism fell, which of course he did in 1991. And he attracted controversy by saying it was never a Russian thing, it was always a foreign thing, and that the communist leaders, a great number of them were Jewish or Georgian or of other ethnic groups, and not actually indigenous Russians. So religiosity was a big part of his worldview. The Orthodox Church, he felt, was really the soul of Russia, and he was excoriating of Western capitalism as well, which he felt was without spirit, and it was just too consumerist, too materialistic, so superficial, false, and just simply multiply people's wants. Anyway, he returned here in the 1990s when his convictions were vacated and his citizenship was restored. As I say, by the millennium, he was like the grand old man of Russian letters, and President Putin had obviously been in the KGB way back in the 70s and 80s had been persecuting the likes of Solzhenitsyn, sending dissident writers to the Gulag. Suddenly there was reconciliation, and Solzhenitsyn thought he was fantastic, and actually Solzhenitsyn had fairly warm words for President Putin, even though, as I said, Putin's main job was squashing internal dissent. Anybody who said a word against the party was in big trouble. So that is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a man of myriad contradictions, a giant in Russian literature, and here he is, honored for all eternity.